and then we'll be live.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, welcome to the public information meeting for the Curry Court and Old Indian Trail study. Sorry, I'm just moving a couple things around on my screen here. All right, thank you. So I did want to thank you for joining us today. I know it's been a pretty eventful day, and thank you for taking the time to join us to talk about the Curry Court and Old Indian Trail watershed study. I'm here today with AE2S. They are the firm that has been selected to help us with this study. So just a couple introductions here. Anne-Marie Kirsch, she is the project manager from AE2S. She will be speaking to us later today. Again, my name is Claudia Guy, and I'm the environmental engineer for the city of Fitchburg. We're also joined by Amber Liefers, who's the AE2S Water Resources Practice Lead. And she'll be here to help answer questions and also help facilitate the presentation today. We're using GoToWebinar for this presentation today. And if you have any questions as the presentation rolls along, feel free to use the question functionality to type up your question. At the end of this presentation, we'll go through those questions and answer them to the best of our ability. And if you think of anything after this meeting, feel free to email me. My email address is claudia.guy@fitchburgwi.gov. We are also asking you to go ahead and fill out the survey, survey 123, which is available at the link shown on the screen here. We're just collecting some information to make sure that we have a full and complete understanding of the stormwater issues that the neighborhood has been facing. We do have some preliminary results, so we think the 10 people who have already filled out that survey we'll go ahead and compile that information and make it available before our next public meeting. Just a quick outline of the presentation today. First, we're going to go over the purpose of the project as well as the scope, stormwater issues that we are aware of, and we'll invite you to let us know if there is anything that we missed. And then we'll move on to existing drainage challenges, potential alternatives to investigate, as well as next steps. So the project purpose and scope, as I'm sure everyone here is very well aware, the Curry Court and Old Indian Trail area has dealt with numerous stormwater issues for many years. And the purpose of this project is to assess the area shown below for potential stormwater improvements. So that area of interest is outlined there is the scope of AE2S's study. More information about the scope. The project scope includes preparation of a feasibility analysis to identify, evaluate, and prepare cost estimates for proposed stormwater improvements to the area of interest. I did want to point out that the feasibility analysis is just that. It will be concept, solutions, and cost estimates. Actual preparation of construction plans for the selected alternative would be a separate project after this project is completed. Going over some stormwater issues facing the neighborhood. One issue that we've seen and heard a lot of is slow moving water and stagnating water in ditches. This photo here is a photo of the culvert where it comes out on the south side of Old Indian Trail. As you can see, there's just a standing pool of water there, which doesn't drain, which means that water will pool there until it either infiltrates or evaporates, which which means that water can stand there for very long periods of time. Standing water in yards, which is both unsightly and makes it difficult to mow. Frequent sump pump usage, risk of basement seepage, groundwater getting into the basement, risk of first floor flooding. We have had reports of that happening to a few structures on Curry Court. This image here is a shed at the end of Curry Court, and you can see that there is water within that structure. Risk of basement flooding, and then also street flooding. So this picture here is the end of Curry Court, kind of standing within the roundabout at the end there. And this is just an image that shows kind of where those problems are located spatially. So poor, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer here, but wet area in the park due to poor drainage, continuously wet ditches on Gold Drive, Cyan, Old Indian Trail, and Curry Court. Some drainage issues for private property where there's just not positive drainage away from the structure, which can cause flooding issues for that structure. The culvert under the road at Old Indian Trail causing localized ponding on both ends of that culvert. And then of course, continuously wet ditches, a side yard that has standing water continuously, which makes it difficult to mow. And then of course, neighborhood-wide problems with sump pumps that run continuously. And if there is anything that we missed, we invite you to go ahead and write those in the comments. We'll read that at the end when we go through the questions as well. Or if you think of something after the meeting, feel free to fill out the survey. The link is there, or you can email me at claudia.guy@fitchburgwi.gov. And then I'm going to hand this over to Anne Marie to talk about existing drainage challenges.
Okay. Make sure I have my screen set up. Yep. Are we seeing the correct screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to check. Okay, so talking about some of the existing drainage challenges. Kind of illustrates, where the problems might be coming from and where we need to get to, and kind of inform us on our decision-making process as we go through the alternatives analysis. So in general, this area, the Curry Court, South Cyan Road, Old Indian Trail, has two general outflow locations. And the light blue is showing the general watershed. That's about 64 acres that flows northwards to Swan Creek after it passes under the railroad. In the magenta color on the left, this area eventually drains south through the Gold's Addition Park down south to Murphy's Creek, and then eventually flows east. Both Swan Creek and Murphy's Creek ultimately discharge into the West Wabisa wetlands and Lake Wabisa. So again, challenges, it's just been really wet. And in this photo here, this is showing an enclosed depression area east of the railroad. This is Curry Court where the water flows under the railroad. And you can see in this picture taken from 2020 is that you see an exposed water surface. So water's pooling there where you can see both the dark water and the green algae. And then even in the field itself, you see these dark areas, hydraulic staining. So that's indication that the groundwater is very close to the surface. Next, I'm going to show this graph. And this just sort of shows generally over the last 100+ years, going back to 1895, here in South Central Wisconsin, generally hasn't been wet or dry. And as if we look at this series on record, again, going back to 1895, how far red goes shows how how big the drought is, and how far green it goes shows how relatively wet it is for that year. And going through history, you kind of see it bouncing back and forth, and you'll have longer periods of drought, like here in the mid 60s. But since the mid 60s, you can see that the green far outweighs the red. So on balance, since the mid 1960s, this area of Wisconsin has been far wetter than it has been drier. So now we're going to walk a little bit through the watershed and go step by step, a little more detail of the general issues that Claudia talked about. So first, we're going to start down here at number 1 in Gold's Addition Park. And here again, we've got these flat, wet ditches through the park, and that makes the clearing and the maintenance very difficult for Fitchburg operations staff. I mean, they've got mowers stuck in there. So here we are looking at kind of a history of photos for this area. Going back to 1955, you can see, very little in terms of housing, few roads. At the time in the 1950s, there was a small constructed pond in what is now Gold's Addition Park, which was later filled in, and this was really a public safety issue as, according to records, a small child drowned in that pond. And as we move forward into 1974, we see more houses being built, more roadways, and this was all being done by a private developer. And what I'd like to point out is you can see in this photo from 1974 is remnants of roadways that were meant to be constructed by the private developer. But given the amount of groundwater and how wet the land was, it just really wasn't feasible to extend the development this far. And at some point, this area was then deeded over to the city. It became Gold's Addition Park. And also notable in this picture is you can see that there's a lot more coverage of trees in the area over the last 35, 40 years. And in addition, what's interesting, if you look at the topography in this area, is that although you can't see the roadways anymore, if you look at the topography, you can still find the remnants of these roadways where the embankments were not fully obliterated. So next, as we walk through the drainage channels, we've got this area at number 2. And this is just that area just immediately south of Old Indian Trail where Claudia showed the pictures of the stagnating water. And again, we've got flat topography. There's not a lot of relief. And also we've got mound septic systems that were constructed along the drainage ways. And that demonstrates 2 things. One, that because the need for mound systems indicates that the groundwater is pretty high and the soils are pretty saturated. And also these mound systems often will take up space in what might have once been a drainage way. And that will impede the ability for water to flow through the area. Now in this next slide, we can kind of show that. Right here, you can see, and this is what I was talking about earlier, these green raised areas, these are the roads. This is representation of elevation. So as you move up into the red, this is a hill, this is going downhill, this is going downhill, this is the Old Indian Trail. We have this localized high point. And this image right here is showing a profile. If you're looking at this ditch more or less sideways, and you're looking from this direction, that you see this localized high point that is at about 925 feet. So water gets kind of stuck there. It can't go south and it can't move north. This is the natural high point. And again, this is the culvert looking north of Old Indian Trail. And this area is looking south, as Claudia indicated before, with the mound system on your left as you look south. Third, as we walk again along our drainage path, is we've got this area where we've got some pumps along South Cyan Road that are tied directly into the ditch system. So this is privately maintained, and it is available for the private residents along South Cyan Road to tap into. And it drains north towards Curry Court. We'll get to that spot next. So now as we move further into area number 4, we've got a very, very flat stretch along Curry Court. In fact, you can see it looking here. And this is actually looking from west to east. and it's got a grade about 0.7%. So that means that the ditch falls at about, a little over half a foot over the course of 100 feet, meaning it's very flat. So it drains to the east, and as you can see here, we've got no defined ditch on the north side of the road. And again, this is looking towards the east. And we've got a ditch on the west side of the road, culverts under driveways, some grading work being done by the homeowner. Finally, number 5. So there's an existing culvert under the railroad. It's a stone constructed box culvert, and it's owned by the railroad. And because of that, it makes it very difficult to alter the drainage under the railroad. This was originally constructed with the railroad. It's owned by the Railroad Transit Commission of Wisconsin. Here's some photos. There's also private drainage going to the existing railroad culvert. And so this is going at the very far east end of Prairie Court. And the second picture is a photo taken from the railroad crossing into that internally drained kind of kettle area left by the glaciers to the east of the railroad. And that brings us to this area number 6. So this area is an internally drained area, and it can fill up and it can actually back water up to the railroad culvert and possibly beyond into Curry Court. Now, these internally drained areas, they're little kettles that were left by the glaciers in the last ice age. And what's interesting about them is that these areas, it's really dependent upon what's going on with groundwater amongst many things. And you can see this photo in 1968, that there might be some groundwater close to the surface, but the farmer's still able to cultivate it for crops. 1976, probably a little bit wetter, doesn't look like it's being cultivated that year. And then moving forward to 2018, when we know it's been really, really, really wet, we now have an exposed water surface elevation. And what we found is that this elevation of this pool is about 913.4 feet. And I believe that this overtopping elevation is about 914.5 feet. So this will need to get about 1.5 foot higher before it even overflows into the natural drainage area downstream towards Swan Creek. And then finally, the last section of our drainage way going north to Swan Creek is very flat, and it has very limited conveyance. And as we look here on the profile, again, going from the depressional area here to Irish Lane, we only have a slope of about 0.4%. So again, just a few inches over 100 feet in terms of positive drainage. So kind of looked again at some historic aerial photos to see if there was any indication of previous ditching. And this is looking again at that previous or the current drainage path. And this is based on contours and LiDAR data. And when you go back to look even to 1955, there's not really a ditch that's been dug like you've seen in some drainage districts to help drain the land, nor in 2010. There's just a little bit of, like we talked about, indication that there's a wet area through the middle of the field. So now that we've talked a little bit about what the existing concerns are, we're going to talk about what are some of the things that we may look at as potential improvements. Now, like Claudia mentioned earlier in the presentation, we're really looking for input from you. I know a lot of the residents have reached out to Claudia in the past about what some of the issues are, and we really wanted to get a full comprehensive view of the residents' thoughts on problems and ideas for potential solutions. So again, look at the link. Feel free to email Claudia, look at the survey 123, and as we get to the end of the presentation, there's also a link to a page updating folks on the current status of the project. So first alternate, oh, and it's also really important to mention that even though we're going to talk in very general terms about 5 potential alternatives, coming out of this meeting and discussions with the city and residents, our scope of services is to really fully flesh out 3 of these potential alternatives as alternatives that we look at. So alternative number 1 is to say, well, what can we do to improve the existing downstream conveyance, how the paths originally go. So what this means is, what can we do to keep the water that flows south to Murphy's Creek to continue going to Murphy's Creek more efficiently? Does this mean dredging out a better ditch through the park? Does it mean acquiring some easements from property owners? And similarly, what can be done along the path that goes north along Curry Court, under the railroad, through the depressional area and off to Swan Creek? The second option would be, well, is there a way to combine the runoff, the water that flows through both of these areas south, and use gravity drainage to Murphy's Creek? What this means is, again, can we use just conveyance through open channels and pipes to get the water to flow to the south? So again, that could include channelization. That might involve working with the city. There are a few parcels here at the corner of South Cyan Road and Curry Court that are currently owned by the city, and use that as a centralized collection area and route the flow potentially along the railroad south to Murphy's Creek. So again, a third alternative would be, well, what if we combined all the drainage and used the pump station and drained south to Murphy's Creek? What might that look like? What that might look like is building of a pump station, either a submersible or non-submersible pump station, again, on the city-owned parcel, collect the water, regrade from Curry Court to make the water drain towards this area, bring the water from the south, and then use a pump station to pump it through a pipe up to the high point of South Cyan Road, and then allow it to flow through gravity the rest of the way to Murphy's Creek. And then similarly to alternatives 2 and 3, we would be looking at for 4, combined gravity drainage north to Swan Creek as an outfall. Again, that might involve some ditching, some culvert improvements, combining that flow as much as possible, at least from the old Indian Trail area, to a combined system, then east along Curry Court, and looking to see if there is the potential for improvements under the railroad and through the internally drained area, and then north to Swan Creek. And finally, the 5th alternative that's currently under consideration is combining the drainage to a pump station facility and pumping it north to Swan Creek. And again, we have our city-owned parcel at the corner of South Cyan and Curry Court. And in this case, we'd be looking at collecting the water from Old Indian Trail and Curry Court, and then forcing it using a pump station to the high point along South Cyan Road, and then allowing it to flow by gravity downhill until it intersects with a tributary to Swan Creek. Now, again, of these 5 alternatives, the city will work to select 3 alternatives for further evaluation. And like any potential improvement, projects have benefits, but there are also drawbacks. There is no silver bullet for this area. You know, if it was easy and inexpensive, it would have already been done. So this is really looking at what's the best course in terms of, maximizing benefits while minimizing the drawbacks. And what are those? Well, some of these drawbacks might be deal breakers. When we talk about routing land across private property, that means we need to get permission from that property owner, either through an easement or through purchase of land. Other deal breakers may include permitting. Moving one water runoff from one watershed to another may be a concern for regulatory agencies. There are wetlands in the area. So there are all of these other considerations that need to be considered. So what are some other things that we might think about throwing into the mix in terms of solution alternatives? One might be a sump pump collection system. As we saw in the earlier slide, there is a system along South Cyan Road. There are other systems in some communities that we work with that these are required as part of new development, where sump pumps are tied in to kind of a network and then flow to a centralized collection system that may or may not include a pump station. Also, drain tiles. Is there a possibility to put additional drainage underground underneath the ditches through a tile system? Third option might be to look at more of an urban section with storm sewer, with inlets and catch basins, more like you would see in the central urbanized area of the city of Fitchburg. And finally, I want to wrap this up by talking about, well, what are our next steps as we go through this process? Next step is to be looking at completing the existing conditions analysis. Earlier, I showed really basic watersheds. So figuring out where the water is coming from, what is the intensity, what are the, what's the level of protection that we want to look at, 10-year event, 25-year event, 100-year events. We also will work with the city to compile the survey 1, 2, 3 results and comments from the residents. We'll be meeting with Wisconsin DNR, Dane County, to review potential permitting requirements. And like we talked about earlier, wetlands, water quality issues, and shoreline zoning may all come into play here. Once we have the existing conditions analysis and have an understanding of permitting requirements, we'll look at the alternatives analysis. Again, selecting the 3 most promising of the 5 that we just talked about. And then we will meet, and once we have the alternatives analysis complete, we'll meet with the public again as part of the public information meeting number 2. And then finally, we'll work with the city in terms of what's the best alternative to move forward in terms of taking the feasibility analysis and turning it into an actual project as part of the capital improvement program. And finally, now's when we'll take any questions. And again, here's the link to the project website and Fitchburg's website. And once we take your questions, I'll put up again Claudia's email address, which is here, claudia.guy@fitchburgwi.gov. And again, we'd really like to thank you for taking the time to meet with us today and look forward to taking any questions.
In your toolbar, you can post questions. I see one question has come in already. And that question that I'll direct to Anne-Marie is that you discussed challenges with navigating water to Swan Creek. Are there challenges to discuss draining to Murphy's Creek?
And again, yes, it's sort of the being able to work through the park, and even at that. Here, let me see. I'll pull up my screen again. Are you still seeing my screen with the slides, Amber?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So, we talked about there's very little slope through here. So even if you can grade through here, there's not. Still gonna be a ton of conveyance, and it's gonna be difficult to bring Prairie Court all the way back here. And also there's gonna be an issue, possibly need for an easement from property owners on the south side of Old Indian Trail in terms of getting water to convey through the open channel. The other issue is if you try to go through ditches along South Cyan Road, you can't because there's a big hill right there. Running a storm sewer through here, also by the time you get to this hill, this is going to be about 20 to 30 feet deep for a storm sewer, which is much more fill on a storm sewer than we would normally see. And again, even if we do the combined drainage here, there's a large private property owner that would require an easement to grade a pretty big ditch, because it would be a pretty big cut as you go through even the side of the hill to get down to Murphy's Creek.
And if I can just hop in, sorry, go ahead.
So in Murphy's Creek, it's more natural barriers than it is constructed barriers.
And I just wanted to hop in to add that, you know, another next step that I guess I was thinking of as we were sitting here is obviously we would reach out to the private property owners who a lot of these solutions would require working with private property owners and getting their permission or seeing if they're amenable to having something on their land. Obviously, it is their land. The city doesn't have permission to just go in and grade or construct or anything like that. So we would want to work with the private property owners to see if they're amenable to that. If there's something an agreement we can come to, that would be a win-win for both the neighborhood and the private property owner. So those are other things we'll be working through. Not just constructability issues.
All right. I've seen a lot of questions come in here. So next question, I'll probably direct to Claudia. How soon will we be meeting with the DNR?
So I anticipate that would happen in the next month to month and a half. It sometimes does take a little bit of time just to get everyone's scheduling worked out, a time that works for everyone. And we want to go to them and we want to make sure we get all of the ideas. Obviously, you saw some concept solutions here today. And we would want to make sure we've had a chance to look at anything else that comes in from residents who have ideas and go through those. And then we would set up a meeting with the DNR to go through them and fully understand the permitting obstacles to all of those concepts. And potentially there might be deal breakers to some of them. But I anticipate that would be the next month and a half.
Okay. Another question I see here is, and I'll direct this one to Claudia as well. What's the time frame for all of this?
So the feasibility analysis that has been funded in the CIP for 2021. The construction design has been put in the CIP for 2022, and then the actual construction of whatever alternative is selected is currently in the CIP for 2023. I did want to point out that the CIP gets reapproved every single year by council. So this year is the only year that's for sure going to happen, and then everything in the future. Currently, the plan is 2022 and 2023, but there's always the potential that might not happen. However, I did want to also mention that this is a very, very high priority project because we do have first floor flooding and we do have a way to rank projects that the city has, and the very highest ranking, which would be the very highest priority, is if you have first floor flooding issues. So I don't foresee that timeline changing, but just with the caveat that it might.
Right. Another question that came in here is, does the water flooding affect the well on Hilltop? I'm not familiar with where Hilltop is.
Are you seeing my
Yes.
it's up in here, and it really is a hilltop.
Okay.
And so I would say that that's not an issue. And isn't there another well Tracy was talking about?
The nearest well is on the road north of Curry Court. I believe that's Hilltop.
Right here. Oh, this is Hilltop. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So that's the one. And no, I would say that's not impacted.
Okay. All right. I'll direct again this next question to Claudia. Is there a vote, or how do we get to the preferred alternative?
The referred alternative. So the way that would work is we'll look at three options, and then we'll present them to you at the next public information meeting. We will get feedback from the community, but the city staff is going to make the decision on which one we're going to recommend to council. Those will be public meetings, so if you have another thought that you disagree with city staff on the recommendation, council will be the one to ultimately make that decision. So you would have the opportunity to speak at those meetings if you wanted something else to be selected. But that's kind of the process there, and we will keep you up to date on when those meetings occur.
Okay. All right.
They can sign up for Notify Me, right, for this project too, if they haven't?
Yes, so that's a good point, thank you. So if you haven't signed up for Notify Me, and Anne-Marie, if you can show that last slide of the presentation again, if you go to the city's website, and actually Amber put it in the chat box there too, if you go to the city's website for this project, there's a link to Notify Me, which is basically a functionality that the city has. You can sign up for various topics that you're interested in receiving notifications for. And there is one called Curry Court and Old Indian Trail Study, and you can sign up to get notifications about this particular project. And so I will be sending out notifications. I sent one out for this public information meeting. I'll send one out for the next public information meeting. I'll send them out whenever we're going to council. And so that would be the best way to get that information.
All right. Next question I see here is a suggestion to make the corner of Curry Court and Cyan Road into an agricultural field. And Claudia, I think you know a little bit of history of kind of those properties, and just kind of what kind of the city wants to kind of see from that.
Yeah, so I can say it's currently park property, and I don't want to speak out of line here, but it's very, very wet, so it's not functioning as a park currently. And that's a decision outside of something I can say will or won't be done, but I would say it's not out of the question.
Okay. And then there's also a comment here of a preference against doing lift stations, just given kind of the upfront costs and the kind of the ongoing operations and maintenance. And I think, certainly as a stormwater engineer, we always try to avoid them as well. For those two exact reasons. Sometimes, there are situations that do call for them to be kind of the best, like we were saying earlier, there's no silver bullet in this particular case. And sometimes doing a lift station, recognizing that, yes, there's cost, there's operations and maintenance, might actually be a lower cost when you consider emergency response and damage to properties and things like that. So certainly look at. So.
And I would say we're not going to select the pump station for more than one of the three options that we look at. But I think, like Amber said, there's no silver bullet, and probably the lift station would give us the most flexibility in terms of good outcomes for the neighborhood. But agreed, it's the most expensive. So I think as part of the cost benefit analysis, it's important to look at the pros and cons of the different options. And obviously the pro of that option would be what we can achieve with it, and the con would be the cost. And depending on how that stacks up to the other options, which might not be able to achieve quite as much for the community, that's a decision that will have to be made. But it won't be more than one of the options that we look at, because we also anticipate that would be expensive.
And the other thing to keep in mind too is it may be a way out of conflicts with private property owners by being able to go over the hill, so to speak, either way on South Cyan Road, and keep infrastructure within the city's right of way.
That's a really good point, Anne Marie, because at the end of the day, if we're not able to work with private property owners to ditch or do something to get the water out of this area, then that might be a deal breaker as well for other concepts, and then we would be looking at pumping as the only feasible alternative, because that can remain within city property.
All right, and then a question came up is there a possibility that the sump lines can be dealt with soon before the full project gets constructed? I'll turn that over to Claudia to start, and then I can provide some commentary as well.
Right, so the issue with the sumps currently is that they're going into our current stormwater system, which is very, very flat. And there's not a whole lot of way to make the ditches have more pitch. And even if we did make the ditches steeper, if they remain dirt ditches, then they will be soggy with a constant flow of water going to them. The only way to have sump pumps not create soggy conditions is to install some sort of pipe system, and that's not in the CIP until 2023.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that, if those were essentially addressed like sooner than like the rest of the project, there might be a risk of essentially redoing a lot of work, which increases costs and things like that. So it makes more sense to kind of have it be done as a single project, so that there isn't rework, there isn't wasted cost, to kind of move that on a faster time schedule. Let's see here. I see a comment here of someone's home is on Cyan across from the city swamp, and I don't know if that's referring to the Gold's Edition Park.
I think it's probably the corner of Cyan and Curry Court, that city property.
Sure. And notes that have had geysers come up through basement floors, and it's gotten worse kind of in the last several years. And just whoever, to the person that wrote that, if you haven't filled out a Survey 123 questionnaire, I'd highly encourage you to put that in there as well, because all that information really helps us as we're thinking about solutions and things like that. So, see another question here. What measures will be taken to prevent the solution from creating unintentional flooding in other areas like back flooding? And also, can pump stations fail? And I'll turn that over to Anne Marie.
So that's part of the whole alternatives analysis, is to look at not producing unintended consequences that are adverse for other people. I mean, that's kind of the whole idea behind water resources. You don't want to solve your problem by making somebody else's problem worse. So the likelihood of causing additional backwater from any of these projects is unlikely, because you're improving the downstream drainage. But that in and of itself, once you start improving that drainage to downstream, we also want to make sure that we aren't adversely impacting somebody downstream. So if you let more water out of this area and all of a sudden it gets to another roadblock downstream, now it might pond on that person's property instead. So you need to make sure that you have to look beyond your property boundary when making decisions. And the question is, can pump stations fail? Yes, like anything that involves, mechanical, electrical systems, we need to have a good operating system in it. We have to have sensors. And that's part of the operation and maintenance part of these types of systems. Just like your car, you can't avoid changing your oil and expect it to run forever.
And and similarly too, like given kind of how flat this area is, ditches and culverts, especially when they're this flat, those can fail too. So like everything else, it needs maintenance and attention to keep functioning. So, great question so far. See another comment here of. And I'll direct this to Claudia. Will residents be assessed for any part of the improvements?
So currently the assessment policy is that any stormwater improvement that's made for the benefit of specific properties would be 100% assessed to those properties. That's something that would have to be looked into more closely. And that's a decision that is still TBD. I'm not sure that is what we would do here. But we would need to look into that more closely and council would make that decision. But currently that's our policy.
See a question here. Can a drainage solution be combined with a Cyan road improvement? And I would say generally yes. Claudia, are there any plans for Cyan to be improved at all?
And I have to say that's a little outside of my knowledge. I would defer to our transportation engineer if he were here. So just in general, the way that works is every year our staff goes through the city and ranks the pavement ratings of the streets, and they determine which ones are in the worst and in need of most repair. And then those would be prioritized, and those are the ones that would be repaved in the order of need based on existing conditions. And I'm not sure how this stretch of Cyan falls on that rank, but if improvements are planned, then it certainly would make sense to coordinate that. If we're putting culverts on the road, under the road or anything like that, we would certainly not want to put it in one year and then patch it and then have to redo that the next year, or do it right after the road's been paved and now we have to, tear up pavement that's just been put down. So that is something that would be coordinated.
Sorry, I had muted myself there for a second. I had seen a question regarding, kind of the route for pumping water to the creek and, minimizing, I think, impacts to residents. And I think, I'll take a quick stab at this one. The arrows that we showed in this presentation are very conceptual. We haven't evaluated these alternatives yet. And so, certainly, as what we said is, one of the potential deal breakers is, lack of permission from certain, residents. And so certainly one of our goals as we look at alternatives will be to minimize to the extent possible of how many private properties we're crossing and things like that. So recognizing that, there's a lot of challenges that we need to address with this project. Let's see here. I see another question here. The flow to the south through the park is not exactly where the yellow arrows are shown. Again, I'll note that the again, they're very conceptual. But the question part of it is, will a survey be done to determine the exact path of the existing water flow? And yes, the city is providing surveying support. We've got great LiDAR. Where LiDAR struggles is, kind of getting the bottom of wet ditches, but certainly survey is part of this, and the city's already done some survey as well. So
to talk about what Amber said, this, for instance, this is a snapshot of LiDAR going through the park, so that we know that the ditch goes this way, it goes to the southwest, and then. But like she said too, there's not as much detail once you get into a heavily wooded area or overgrown ditch.
All right. This is a question from another person. This kind of gets to the maybe there is a Cyan Road construction project coming up. Will the current south tiles be adjusted or disrupted given the road construction that's coming up this year?
I don't think I can answer that question at this moment. I can take that as a follow-up.
All right. Let's see here. Can we put a retention pond in the Curry Court land? And I'm assuming this would be the city property or the properties that would accommodate storm events. And I'll have Anne Marie take that question.
So a detention pond may be part of the solution, but it's not going to be the only solution. And part of that problem is because that land is already really low, right? And so if you dig a hole, that hole is just going to fill up with water, especially with groundwater when the groundwater is high. So if you dig a hole into the ground and you basically developed a lake, unless you build up berms on the side and really almost dam it in, you're not going to get effective detention. And in that case, the only way to really make that effective detention is if you can use a pump station to pump it down so that it is empty when the next storm event comes in.
Great point, Anne Marie. Next question that I see here is, and I'll direct this to Claudia, and I think this has to do, kind of with city CIP planning, is are, all or any of the options presented fundable?
So the cost estimates have not been done at this point. Currently, I did have the CIP open. Oops. If I can get to it, here we go. So currently in the CIP, we were anticipating $560,000 for construction in 2023. Of course, that is just a ballpark figure at this point. Another part of this feasibility study is picking the solution and how much it will cost. So that number will change based on this study.
Yeah, and one of the, sort of parts of our company is essentially doing just that, is helping communities find funding. And, sometimes it's pretty straightforward. Sometimes it needs to get a little creative. And so, yes, certainly the goal of the alternatives will be that they are both constructible and fundable. Next question that I see here is, can a gravity pipe be considered across the property to the south of Old Indian Trail, so that might be more agreeable to the private property owner? And Anne Marie,
and that's talking about this area here. And we know that there's a high point, and when you start looking at this, it's possible, maybe. We haven't gotten into that level of detail. We'd have to see how deep that pipe would need to go. And then once you decide how deep that pipe needs to be, then that tells you how long the pipe needs to be until you intersect the grade of the ditch. So it's possible, but I can't make it a guarantee at this point.
See another question here, and I'll start with Anne Marie here. What about putting in a plastic liner for the ditch?
And that kind of depends upon roadway. You know, in terms of, you're right, making a ditch smoother does increase conveyance. But we're, you know, then you introduce all sorts of potential maintenance issues for the city in terms of mowing. Does this get dinged up? From an environmental standpoint, it's probably not going to be looked on very favorably in terms of taking all the grassed area out. And this is something we'll talk about a little bit more as we talk about alternatives in the next PIM, is kind of these concepts behind drainage and what are some of the things that can be done to increase conveyance of these ditches. But you're right, like regular mowing of ditches will make the grass shorter and make the water flow better. But one of the problems we already have is that there's so much water in the ditches. How do you get effective mowing done? So it's something that'll be looked at in general, ditch capacity.
Claudia, do you have anything to add to that?
So plastic lining of the ditch, I'm not sure that I've ever seen that. I've seen concrete lined ditches. Plastic lined ditch, I don't know, that sounds like, I'm not familiar with that technology. Most of the plastic that I'm familiar with would degrade very quickly over time with UV and then freeze thaw cycles. It doesn't seem like a very durable option, but there might be certain plastics that I'm not familiar with that might be an option. I'm not familiar with that.
And also, concrete line channels, like Claudia brought up, used to be used more frequently in the past, and they're really kind of frowned upon, not just the maintenance and the environmental impacts, but also roadside safety. If the roadside ditches, lining them with concrete is just not good. And on this roadway, you don't have a lot of in terms of area to run off the road safely. And if you put concrete in it, it doesn't play well with cars.
Another question that came up here is, you know, are there easements necessary with pump station options? And I think that's, you know, probably one of the benefits of a pump station is that since it's operating under pressure conditions, there's a little bit more flexibility in which direction it goes. And so the pump station options would probably have the least amount of easements that would be necessary. Not to say that there wouldn't be any, but certainly probably the least out of all the options. Let's see here. Another question that came in here. Would a holding pond be established to collect water from sump pumps for the pumping station? And I'll direct that to Anne Marie.
That is potentially something that we would look at, is if we had a sump pump collection system. Again, talk about the detention pond, but as I mentioned earlier, if you have a detention pond that's lower than that existing ground elevation, it would require a pump station such that there's room for the water to keep flowing into. One of the consequences of that is you may wind up pumping groundwater as groundwater comes to fill in from the sides of the detention pond if it's constructed below the water table.
Right. Another question, and appreciate everyone staying on here and asking great questions here. Another question, the city lands in the area are parkland. Will the stormwater utility reimburse the park fund for using parkland for stormwater? I'll direct that to Claudia.
So that has not been discussed. That is certainly something that we would coordinate with Scott Endel. He's the Parks Director, and I'm not aware of. I think this would be an amenity to the park land to help it drain better. So in that way, I think it's something that they would want. on their property. But it's certainly a question to ask.
And to kind of build on that too, like an open water area for a pump station isn't necessarily, there are lift stations that are built without them. It's just the advantage of storage with a lift station is that you can usually decrease the pumping capacity because you have a little bit of storage to buffer water coming in. And so, as you get a higher and higher capacity pump station, the costs go up and up and up. And so the advantage of using, kind of surface storage is so that pumping rate can go down, your electrical costs go down, and all that sort of stuff as well. See another question in here of could local or state grant money be used to offset construction costs? And I'll start with Anne Marie and then turn it over to Claudia.
The answer's maybe. And there may be programs, but unfortunately, this does not hit any of the main target for state funding anyway. Because even though there's flooding, it's not in what's called a flood hazard area, a map floodplain. So that makes it a little challenging. And a lot of the other DNR grants right now are really targeted towards water quality, meaning what's in the water. Is there sediment? Is there phosphorus? And both Murphy's Creek and Swan Creek are listed for both phosphorus and sediment, I believe, and possibly habitat. But the goal of this project is not to address water quality or habitat specifically.
Yeah, one potential grant that's out there, and the and I apologize for the noise in the background if you can hear that. Is the FEMA has a couple of grant programs that don't necessarily have to be tied to a floodplain. In the state administers that, and typically in the past they've really focused that program on structure buyouts, like basically buying structures and tearing them down, which is not, I want to repeat, not the goal of this project. But the FEMA has changed their funding program in the last year to make that funding program maybe a little bit more flexible. The state has incentive to make that a little bit more flexible. And the key there is showing, and if that's something that wants to be pursued down the road, the key is showing that the cost of the project is less than the benefit of the project from a flood damage avoided standpoint. So that is one potential program that's out there that can help fund a project like this. So, Claudia, anything else?
I guess I agree with Anne Marie. Most of the funding that's available is for water quality, which unfortunately that's not the goal of this particular project. And Amber, just to piggyback off of you talking about those FEMA grants, the way that grant program works is, again, you would apply and you would basically be ranked similar to the way that the city has our ranking for CIP project. They have a ranking system for FEMA projects as well. And I'm not sure that this would be ranked very high. Groundwater entering homes is not a stormwater issue. Stormwater flooding entering first floor, there's a little bit of a nuance there. That is a flooding issue. And then they look at, is it a primary structure that's being flooded or a secondary structure? So at the end of the street there, that's a secondary structure. That's a shed. That's not someone's home. Although there are, I believe I've heard at least one primary structure that has been flooded, actual flood waters. and not groundwater. So that would get us a little bit higher, but it's just one structure. And we would be up against projects where many homes, primary structures are getting flood water into the structure on the first floor. So I would say that's pretty unlikely, but it is something we can look into more.
Sure. All right. I'll direct this next question to Claudia. Are there any plans in the future to put city sewage, so extend sanitary sewer to this area?
I do not believe that is on the radar for plans. No.
And I'll direct the next question here to Anne Marie. Could we, or could French drains in the park behind Old Indian Trail be used to assist with drainage?
Okay, so couple issues here. What we consider French drains is usually something that's deeper than it is greater in area, and those are regulated by U.S. EPA as Class 5 injection wells, which are difficult to permit. And you're also battling high groundwater. If the groundwater is already high, there's still nowhere for that water to go. There's just not a lot of infiltration potential in this area, mainly because of clayey wetland types, hydric soils, and high groundwater. So in this case, infiltrating on the lower end of the watershed's probably not a really high value effort.
That's a great question though. There's a comment here of allegedly there is a recorded easement at the east end of Curry Court already that's been recorded. Claudia, is that your understanding as well, or?
So that is my understanding as well. The easement currently actually goes through a structure. It doesn't follow the private pipes that are located outside of the easement. So that's something we'll be working with that property owner on. Nobody wants to see that structure get torn down, but it does give, obviously the city had the right to bring water through that property. So I think that does make that particular easement much more feasible that we will get it, because we have quite a bit of, I guess, more on our side, I guess, for getting that. But I think the goal would be to move that so we don't impact the structure, and then we can build something in a different location that would achieve the same thing.
The next question, this is a really good question. This kind of fits into the, is there plans for sanitary sewer? Do septic systems contribute to the problems? And Claudia and Anne Marie and I talked about this actually the other day. The interesting thing is that there's city water, but then there's the septic systems. And so there is a potential that there's essentially water being added to the system. Based on kind of looking at things though, it looks like those likely don't contribute, but it's something that we certainly want to keep an eye out for as we move through this project. But that's a great question, and one that we've discussed because that came up as a potential issue in the, when we were kind of looking at what potential solutions make sense for this project.
Right, and just to add a little bit to that, we did find that the water that is being supplied to this area is coming from the same groundwater aquifer that the infiltration is going into. So it's not like we're taking water from a different aquifer and then bringing it to this aquifer. It's coming into and out of the same aquifer, but it is still a question we want to look at. And sorry, a little bit more history on that. the question came up on why that is the case. Why do we have city water and not city sewer? And the history on that is that private wells did not have good water quality, and actually the DNR required the city to supply residents of this area with public water. So that's the history on why that's the case.
Another question here, and we're just about through the questions here, and again, appreciate everyone staying on here. And I'll direct this to Anne-Marie. Do adding street trees or more trees in the parks decrease stormwater issues?
So there are a couple of things going on. Trees are a very important part of the hydrologic cycle. One thing that they do is you plant more trees, as the rain falls from the sky, you get what's called interception. So that's what lands on the leaves and stops water from even getting to the ground to run off. And then trees also and plants do what's called evapotranspiration. Through their root system, take water out of the groundwater, transfer it through carbon dioxide and water out to the environment. So they're a part of it. And also, so that affects how much water runs off the land when it rains, all things being considered. Less water is going to run off a heavily vegetated area than, say, a rooftop or a roadway. So that's one thing. And then it's also part of the initial uptake of the stormwater or during normal conditions in terms of balancing groundwater, surface water, and atmospheric water. That answer the question?
I think so. Yeah, yes, they can help. I think on the scale that what we need in this particular situation, it's not the same scale.
Right, and then the other factor again is going back to the roadside safety. City and county requirements require that trees be a certain distance off the shoulder of the road and outside of what's called that clear zone. So if there's a run off the road, you're not getting trees.
And we're at the last question here. This is a really good question and I'll direct this to Claudia. Are there any recommendations for what landowners can do on their private land with the standing water in the meantime?
So things you could look into is hiring a drainage expert. Landscape companies might be able to help as well. The goal is to provide positive drainage away from your home, and what I mean by that is you want your ground to slope away from your house, so that water will run away from your house rather than standing near it. That's probably the best thing you can do if you are having problems with standing water near your structure. You would want to try to get positive drainage. Another thing to consider, and I think everyone here is already doing this. I believe most sump pumps go all the way to the ditch. But if it doesn't, just keep in mind that you do want your sump pump discharge to be at least 10 feet away from your home, just to avoid recycling of water is what it's called. If you put it right outside of your home, then it can infiltrate right there and then come back into your basement. So you would want to get that as far away from your home as possible. And I think most people are already getting it to the ditch, which is where you would want it to be.
All right. Sounds good. And there were a couple other, more comments related to survey 1, 2, 3, and kind of overall. And we'll make sure that we follow up with folks on those as well. But I believe those are all the questions that we've gotten. Claudia, do you want to close things up here?
Sure. Well, thank you everyone again for your time, for joining us today. Again, if you have any other questions or comments, feel free to follow up with me. We do appreciate everyone reaching out and giving ideas and your thoughts. And we're really looking forward to digging into this and making some progress. I know everyone's looking forward to some progress on this. And we will be back in touch as soon as we have more information.